I would expect more, Lewis, pulling that jersey on to represent the arts. It's almost like representing your country. There were service people in the crowd. In fact, there was a guy watching who played in that game at Lee back in 1994. There's deep, deep bonds and stuff being built here. This is making history.
Martin, take us back to pre-1994. Rugby League was not recognised in the armed forces, wasn't played in the armed forces. Just give us some of the context as to why.
The Army, is the organisation it is because it runs on great governance, and there's rules and guidance for absolutely everything. And they had something called synopsis sports, which were written down in probably Queen's regulations and governed by the Army Sports Control Board. Worked out of Clayton Barracks in Aldershot, had a director who was a general, etc. And Rugby League wasn't on the list, never had been on the list. And because it wasn't on the list, you couldn't play it, either in soldiering time or at weekends. Because if you wanted to play sport at weekends or for your local club, you had to have permission in writing from your commanding officer. And the reason for that was if you got injured, there could quite rightly be questions of why isn't this person soldiering? And the answer is playing football as a civilian or cricket or whatever is not good enough unless you have permission. So permission had to be given. And if you asked for permission to play rugby league, the answer was no, not a recognised sport.
When you look at some of the sports that were allowed at that time, were permitted, what was the rationality behind rugby league not being on that list?
I suspect the list had been going a long time, and there was a lot of traditional sports. And the Army, when I joined, was a very divided army between the officers and the sort of the non-commissioned ranks and private soldiers. And there was things in it like polo and traditional British society type sports, sailing, and things. And rugby league just wasn't included. And the point was you were authorised to play. You could claim travel expenses when you were representing your regiment or your corps or indeed the army. You could, be accommodated formally by filling in documentation. With rugby league, there was none of that. None of that process was available to you.
Were there some actively trying to stop it?
Yeah. So it wasn't like it was banned. It wasn't like there was a big decision that, this is now a policy like the Vichy government did in France of, outlawing rugby league and confiscating its assets. There was never anything like that. But there was this situation where you were not permitted to play. There were two famous games in the Second World War where Northern Command played rugby league and rugby union against each other. Rugby league won both games. And there are a couple of notable incidents where things were put on orders, which is what governs the activities of each day. Banning people. There was a Guards regiment that we wanted to play rugby league, and they came out and banned it. So the change came about in the early 1990s when the All-Party Parliamentary Rugby League group, and the notable people that I recall were David Hinchliffe, the MP for Wakefield, and Ian McCartney was the MP for Wigan, began to ask questions in the House of Commons, which of course is recorded in Hansard, about why don't soldiers play rugby league. And the first answer was, we don't know, we'll find out. And the second one was, none of them want to. We haven't got any desire to play rugby league in the British Army. And I think, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but sort of Mr. Hinchliffe and Mr. McCartney went back and said, well, we've found some that do want to play rugby league. And what happened was there was a sevens competition, which you would call illegal. It wasn't insured, if you like, in the normal way that army sport would be. And it was at Chepstow, the Army Apprentice College in Chepstow. And a chap called Major Martin Morris, a Wiganer, was the organiser. And he went out on a limb and a signal was sent out. So the signal would be the predecessor of, I guess, email, and it was more like a telegram. Went to all the army units in the world, I think, saying there's a sevens rugby league competition. Come to Chepstow. I recall with the regiment I was in at the time, I was in the Royal Engineers. I had to go and ask for a minibus because I got a group of people who wanted to play, and they said, "Yeah, sure." And I said, "It's not rugby union, it's rugby league." They went, "Oh," and the answer was, "Okay, but don't do anything daft. Don't get caught. Don't." So all we did that was a bit daft was win the competition, which brought a load of attention to us. So that was the first thing. But we were still playing without authority until, from memory, 24th, maybe 29th of April 1994, when Jeremy Hanley, who was the Armed Forces Minister, made an announcement that rugby league was now permitted in the armed forces, and it was a great occasion.
What was the response within the army and the wider armed forces when it was permitted? Was it positive? Were a lot of people putting their hand up to get involved?
Yeah, they were. It was an exciting time. A lot of the rugby union people said, "Let's have a go at this," because it was pretty big. It was coming big on the telly. Sky Sports were doing a great job. The Great Wigan team were at its peak. Rugby league had a fairly high-profile BBC and Sky. People like Hilary Hanley and maybe Gary Schofield were known, and here we were with this fresh and vibrant sport. So yeah, it flew pretty quickly, and I was appointed as the secretary, and the secretary is the person who organises the sport. There were other titles as well, and we made a lot of progress very, very quickly. So we had the army team. We then set up the corps, so the Royal Artillery, the Royal Engineers, Royal Signals, electrical and mechanical engineers, etc., with the next tier down in the pyramid, and then all the regiments within those corps joined in as well. I think we peaked at something like 36 regimental teams, 10 corps teams, an army at under 21 women, men, and there was a team called the Rats, which was race against time and senility. That was at its peak, but we peaked quickly. There was that much energy and enthusiasm behind it. And indeed, the press got behind us. When the Army played the Air Force, the press corps were there, as were Sky. And it was reported in the sports pages. I'm not comfortable with the word ban, because, like I say, it physically wasn't a ban. It's just that there wasn't a mechanism to play, and that mechanism was put in place rather than a ban lifted, if that makes sense.
Talk us through. So, permitted in 1994, first entry into the Challenge Cup in, I believe, 99. Or was it 2000?
That might have been earlier. It might have been 97, 98, something like that. I can tell you who the teams played, because the Navy played Hull Dockers, the Army played Dewsbury Celtic, and the Air Force played a team from near Cass, I think. And the amazing thing was we all won. So the armed forces all went through to the second round in the first time they played.
So talk us kind of through, I guess, that bit of time and space between being permitted to being at that level, in terms of just before you even get to playing quality and level, the amount of organisation and infrastructure and that kind of thing that must have had to have been put in place in what is a relatively short space of time.
It was an amazing thing. So the first Army game, I had to learn how to use a facsimile machine, and in those days there was no typewriters or anything like that. You'd write it with a ballpoint pen on a ruler, so it looked neat. And I had to. The thing was so slow. I'd stayed up sort of through the night in the chief clerk's office, faxing bits of paper through, saying, the following player has been selected to play for the Army at Rugby League, which was questioned. Are you sure? This isn't real. And we were playing at Hilton Park, the old league ground, in April '94, and we didn't have anything. We just didn't have anything at all. And I recall the night before the game, a lot of lads. I'm from Warrington, so a lot of lads stayed in a house I owned. Wasn't properly furnished, but the electricity worked. But they all slept on the floor. or the other guys slept in something called the Barla School of Excellence, the British Amateur Rugby League Association School of Excellence, which was also in Leigh. They slept in the gym there. And then we got to Hilton Park and we had some new shirts only, no shorts or socks. We had some bizarre shorts designed for 16-year-olds, grey rugby union type things. But the day was saved by the Leigh kitman and Steve Sims, who was the coach there at the time, were incredibly helpful. And we played our first game in Leigh's kit. So we had nothing, literally nothing, and no experience in what we were doing. We had to really start from the ground up. But it was an amazing time, and we had some amazing support from the RFL, from Barla, from the media. So Ray French was very supportive, Dave Hadfield, John Wally. I remember Tom O'Donovan was the RFL development manager at that moment in time, and Tom was just outstanding. We were one of Tom's projects, and it was just fantastic. I think the high point of the early years was there was an Army Sports Development dinner at Sandhurst, and Rugby League was invited. And I recall the car we were in, and this was black tie. Ian Sproat was the Minister for Sport, I think. Nicholas Soames was there, Winston Churchill's grandson and a Member of Parliament. And it was hosted by the Adjutant General, who was a guy called General Mike Rose, ex-SAS, and led the United Nations troops in Sarajevo and Bosnia. So it was this pretty special occasion, and we were made very, very welcome by Mike Rose. And he articulated to me something I didn't know, that I think he said 45% of the armed forces was drawn from the rugby league playing areas of Cumbria, Lancashire and Yorkshire, Cheshire. And he just said, it's great to have you here. And recognising, and this is one of the reasons, so the purposes for Army Sport are multiple. Wednesday afternoon and Army Sport came around because of Field Marshal Montgomery, who recognised the importance of belonging to a team and esprit de corps, etc., fitness and teamwork. But another one, particularly with the Army representative team, is a recruiting tool, where young men and young women who may see an opportunity to play sport at an international and high level by being a member of the armed forces. So Mike Rose was responsible for recruiting and recognised that straight away. So it's just fantastic. We want to use you to attract people to join the army from the rugby league playing areas where it may be part of their heritage. So that was a good time.
In the years that followed, you mentioned they were slightly late to the party, but the Air Force and the Navy established teams. That kind of trio of rivalries between the three has developed nicely, obviously playing against each other pretty regularly. And that must be a pretty special thing within the armed forces to have.
The Army were recognised in '94 internally by Army Sports Control Board. The Air Force, although they were playing, doing everything right, weren't recognised, which meant it was difficult for the guys to travel and get time off work, whereas the Army guys could get time off work. And when I say time off work, time away from their barracks to go and participate in sport. The Air Force had it tougher, and the Navy were nowhere, but the Navy reached out to us. Wayne O'Kell, Chopper Smallbone, Wilkie, and I remember them coming to see me. I was refereeing a game in Arborfield, which isn't far up the road from Portsmouth, and they came to the game, and then we had a conversation afterwards and said, we're desperate to get it going. Can we work together? We said, yeah. So I invited the Navy to enter the Army Nines competition. Sevens had morphed to nines by this stage, and so a Navy team entered the Army Nines, and they were just brilliant. It was a great day, and they won it. The Navy beat the Parachute Regiment in the final, or one para, more accurately, in the final. And big news. Navy wins the Army Cup, sort of thing, and that was a catalyst for them. I think the story. What happened was they arrived back at HMS Collingwood, jubilant and loud, and attracted the attention of Admiral John Chadwick and said, "Who are you and what are you doing?" and they said, we're the Navy Rugby League team and we've just won the Army Nines. And again, like us and the Air Force before, we're sort of playing without the proper authority, but such was the energy and enthusiasm of these people to, become part of this sport they love, the rugby league family, and do well. And not long afterwards came an invitation from the RFL, and the RFL said, we'd like to invite you into the Challenge Cup. And what we want is, because they knew that every year there was an inter-services rugby league Challenge Cup, so all three would play each other. And there were 3 games, and there was a champion announced, which was, the winningest team by matches won or aggregate scores at the end. And the Army were the winners for the first 7 years, I think. One year we shared it with the Air Force. So it was obviously going to be the Army, but I said to the RFL, either have us all or none of us. It's critical to the armed forces. We work together in sort of, everyday life, and certainly in combat situations. We're going to work together in rugby league. And there was a bit of to and fro in, and then word came through. You're in Navy, Army, Air Force, all in the Challenge Cup, which caused huge attention. I remember having a long conversation with Christopher Irvin, who was at the Times at the time. And if this was a breakthrough moment, was the entry into the Challenge Cup, where the Army that year actually made it through to the 3rd round and played Rochdale Hornets away. And there was a big double-page spread in the News of the World, of all papers. I recall some of the senior officers being concerned which part of the News of the World we were in, whether it was the front end or the back end. But it was the back end, and pictures of a tank, and and here come the Army. Interestingly, we got schooled that day. We were in it for 10 minutes, and then Danny Sculthorpe absolutely killed us with his offloading game. And for the first time, we learned the gulf between, and our men were fit, Army fit, which is different to rugby league fit, but nevertheless fit. We learned how difficult it was to play the game at the top end, and Rochdale, weren't a Super League team.
Don't want to fall into the trap of kind of over romanticising things a little bit too much, but if you were to line up kind of, I guess, the core values that we talk about in rugby league as a working class sport, especially a hard working sport, community, all of that kind of thing, and then line up the equivalent values associated to what it takes to be successful in the armed forces, how much of an overlap do you think there is? Do you think that's why it's been a success?
Yeah, I'm blessed and tortured with my memory, Lewis, that it's so good of certain things, not all of it. There was an amazing moment, and this was a sort of social occasion, and Lieutenant General Sir Scott Grant, who was the most marvellous and supportive president of Army Rugby League, just a legend of a bloke. He got rugby league, and he ended up as the Quartermaster General. So he's on the Army board. He's in the top echelons, and he spoke to us, and he said these words. I'm going to try and be as accurate as I can. Rugby league is the only sport played in the British Army which epitomises all of the qualities required of a soldier: fitness, courage, discipline, teamwork, and this type of thing. I wrote it down at the time, and we used to use it. And somebody once said to me, "You can't say that." I said, "Well, I didn't. General Grant did, and if you have a problem with what he said, go and see General Grant." And funnily enough, nobody ever did. But the strong sense of discipline was his high point of what we did, and rugby league absolutely epitomises the qualities you need to be a serviceman. I think soldier, but the other two sports as well. There's no place to hide. You've got to work hard all the time. There's no rest. You just got to go for 80 minutes. And to go for 80 minutes, you've got to prepare an awful lot to make sure you can. So I watched the Army versus Oral St. James game the other day, and Oral St. James had it for the first 60 minutes. And I was remembering in my time when I was sort of running the Army team, we appeared to pull away in the last 20 minutes of the game, but we never did pull away. Other teams fell off, and we were able to keep going at the same pace. And it was It was that we had that in us that you just didn't give up. And you know, you look left and right, and your mate was there, and you just looked out for each other. We had some skill as well and some speed, and we could play some football. But mainly it was just doing it tough and never giving in.
So that brings us up quite nicely to the game coming up, Betfred Challenge Cup, Army versus the Navy. First time ever that these two teams play each other in the Challenge Cup, I believe. That's significant in itself, but as somebody who's been there from the start, there must be a sense of, not personal accomplishment maybe, but as a wider thing of how far Armed Forces Rugby League has come. This is quite a good signifier, I guess, quite a good lightning rod to look at it and go, you know, how good is this?
Yeah, I'm thrilled. The armed forces are just constantly evolving, you know. And the decades I served, it was 1980s was about the Cold War and Northern Ireland and sort of end of the British Empire type stuff. The 90s was former Republic of Yugoslavia and the Gulf War, and then the noughties was Afghanistan and Iraq. And the armed forces constantly evolve, and the shape and size of it changes, and the demands placed on the servicemen are very, very different. So from being fairly static in the 80s and quite big, there was 180,000 soldiers when I joined. It's now down at 80 or 90,000, so it's half the size. So to be able to do what the guys have done, of continue to play this great brand of rugby league football at the level they do and get to the second round of the Challenge Cup is just fantastic. It's now they're all in all three services. The sport of rugby league is established and respected. You know, it's 27 years this year since that first game at Lee, and if I think about where we started with nothing to where they've got to now, where there's infrastructure, it's played at all levels, you know, so under 23s, women, seniors, we've had service people representing their country for the Great Britain and Ireland amateur teams, as it were, and the Bala teams. There are people who played in the, what are they called? The Community Lions teams. That's the word I'm looking for. And also some servicemen are playing professional and indeed Super League on sabbaticals out of the armed forces right now. So that's fantastic, and it mirrors other parts of the sport. I've talked about playing the game. There's also, you know, a remarkable group of administrators who, in adversity, sometimes there was never organised things to disrupt rugby league, but there were certainly some individuals who went out of their way to make life difficult for us. And I remember a story. A great friend and mentor of mine by the name of Colonel Mike Bowman called me to his office one day. I had to travel to get there, and he gave me some tea, so I knew I wasn't in that much trouble. And he said, "What are you fighting against?" And I said, "All these injustices that were going on. Real or perceived injustices when it wasn't, you know, going well for soldiers, and barriers were being put in the way for them to play." And Colonel Bowman said, "What do the soldiers want?" So I looked at him. He said, "What do the soldiers want to do?" I said, "They want to play rugby league." He said, "Well, just focus on enabling them to play rugby league. Don't worry about anything else. They can see what's going on, and they'll see that you and rugby league is a good place to be, and you're good people and doing that." And that spirit continues with the administrators I see now. And there's a great group of match officials, and there's just a load of people all over the armed forces who enable this to happen. And I recall myself and Damien Clayton. I was a corporal, and Damien was a senior aircraftsman, which is like a lance corporal, if you like. Damien's now a squadron leader, a highly decorated squadron leader, running his own big team in East Yorkshire at a defence school. And we had to sort of, we stood shoulder to shoulder, and we toughed it out sometimes when it was difficult, and with the backing of the right people, we made it work. So to see two teams, and I was at the first ever Army Navy game, which was played in the Aldershot Military Stadium, which was famous for hosting superstars in the 70s and 80s. And the Army destroyed the Navy in the first half, but the Navy came back in the second half and gave us a taste of what was going on. And 5 years later, the Navy were winning inter-service championships. And I think so the demise of field gun, you might remember field gun, which was done at the Royal Tournament at Earl's Course every year, stopped being as important, and those people who were in field gun came over to rugby league because the qualities of field gun were similar to those in rugby league, of tough, hard work. Let's keep going.
What can we expect on Saturday then? The impression I get from speaking to people is that it's going to be pretty blood and thunder and pretty intense, and these guys are just going to bash each other for 80 minutes.
I would expect war, Lewis. The guys have are conditioned from the moment they join the armed forces to operate in a certain way. You respond to instructions and command. You never give up. You fight. And I don't mean inappropriate fighting. I'm just talking fight until you've got no more fight in you. So no one's going to give up. It'll be very, very physical. They will accelerate into contact, be that ball carrying or defence. There's a huge amount of pride, which is difficult to articulate to somebody who's not been a serviceman or servicewoman. And that's pride in their jersey and their, the Navy called themselves the senior service. Because they've been serving the country for longer than anybody else, and the Army have pride. And there's also what is unseen is loads of different branches of the Navy come together to represent it, so it truly is the best. And the Army will feature many different regiments and corps who come together. The colours are important, so the Navy are in blue and the Army are in red, and the Air Force are in sky blue, and this stuff matters. And because they've been playing since the early 90s now, it's got its own culture. It's got its heritage. It's got its values. And the great teams of the past are talked about. And it's in Aldershot. And people will go to Aldershot. They will descend on Aldershot. And there'll be people there who probably were playing nearly 30 years ago. And there's a sort of, not much gets said, but a lot of sort of, a lot of nodding and smiling, and you don't need to say much. Because there's something special within those groups of people, and it's been there for a long time.
Again, wary of falling into the trap of kind of over-egging it a little bit, but we're going to have an armed forces team, a services team in the third round of the Challenge Cup.
Yeah.
Obviously, with the pandemic last year, it was only professional clubs and semi-professional clubs that entered. In terms of a story of one of these teams going on a cup run, and we don't know the draw yet, obviously, but we don't know what might happen or how far one of these teams might go. In terms of a rugby league story coming out of the pandemic, particularly when community rugby league, non-professional rugby league's taking a hit, how significant could that be?
Well, just be huge. It'd be huge for the game. It'd be huge for the game within the armed forces, but also, one of the other things I remember was how passionate and how strong it was for the families of the service people. Service families are there's a difference with them. A lot of it is pride, and then pulling that jersey on to represent the army. It's almost like representing your country. It's that big a deal. So I also now there's such pride from the whole nation to support the armed forces. Wherever you go, you get some warmth. The Army will have got some warmth at Oral St James last week, and I know there were service people in the crowd. In fact, there was a guy watching who played in that game at Lee back in 1994. So there's deep bonds and stuff being built here. This is making history. This game will be, we're looking back 25, 26 years. People will look back at this game in 25, 26 years' time in the way that I am now.